Welcome to Lifelong Echoes, where we explore the remarkable stories of people who changed our world forever. Today, we embark on an incredible journey with Charles Darwin, a young man who was supposed to become a country minister, but instead became the scientist who revolutionized our understanding of life itself. This is the story of how a 5-year voyage around the world led to the most important scientific discovery in human history. On February 12, 1809, in the small English town of Shrewsbury, a baby was born who would one day explain the origin of every living thing on Earth. His name was Charles Robert Darwin, and from his earliest days, he was fascinated by the natural world around him. Charles was born into a wealthy and intellectual family. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a famous doctor and scientist who had already written about the possibility that all life might have evolved from common ancestors. His father, Robert Darwin, was a successful doctor who expected Charles to follow in the family tradition of medicine. But young Charles had different interests. While other children played with toys, Charles collected beetles, rocks, birds' eggs, and shells. His room looked like a natural history museum, filled with specimens he had found during long walks in the countryside around Shrewsbury. Charles was not a particularly good student in traditional subjects. His teachers at Shrewsbury School complained that he was more interested in collecting insects than learning Latin and Greek. His father once scolded him, saying, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat-catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." But Charles had a gift that his teachers didn't recognize. He was a brilliant observer of nature. He could spend hours watching how different birds built their nests, how insects moved, and how plants grew. He had what scientists call the naturalist's eye, the ability to notice patterns and details that others missed. When Charles was 16, his father sent him to Edinburgh University to study medicine. Dr. Darwin hoped that Charles would become a doctor like him and his grandfather. But Charles was horrified by the brutal medical procedures of that time. In an age before anesthesia, surgery was performed on conscious patients. Charles attended one operation and ran out of the room, unable to watch the patient suffering. Realizing that Charles would never become a doctor, his father suggested a different career, the church. In those days, many country ministers were also naturalists who studied the plants and animals in their parishes. Dr. Darwin thought this might be perfect for his nature-loving son. So Charles went to Cambridge University to study theology and prepare to become a minister. But even at Cambridge, Charles spent more time collecting beetles than studying religious texts. He became famous among his fellow students for his insect collection and his enthusiasm for natural history. Charles's professors at Cambridge noticed his passion for science and encouraged it. Professor John Henslow, a botanist, became Charles's mentor and friend. They took long walks together, discussing plants, rocks, and the mysteries of the natural world. Other students called Charles the man who walks with Henslow. Professor Adam Sedgwick, a geologist, taught Charles how to read the story of Earth written in rocks and fossils. Charles learned that the Earth was much older than most people believed, and that it had changed dramatically over vast periods of time. Charles was also influenced by reading Personal Narrative by Alexander von Humboldt, a German explorer who had traveled through South America. Humboldt's vivid descriptions of tropical forests, exotic animals, and volcanic mountains filled Charles with dreams of adventure and discovery. As Charles prepared to graduate from Cambridge in 1831, he faced the prospect of spending his life as a quiet country minister. But fate had other plans. Professor Henslow received a letter that would change Charles's life forever. The letter was from Captain Robert Fitzroy of the Royal Navy. Captain Fitzroy was planning a surveying voyage around the world on a ship called HMS Beagle. The voyage would take several years and would map the coastlines of South America and other distant lands. Fitzroy wanted to bring along a naturalist who could study the plants, animals, and geology of the places they visited. Professor Henslow immediately thought of Charles. Though Charles was only 22 years old and had never traveled far from England, Henslow believed he had the perfect combination of enthusiasm, knowledge, and character for such an expedition. When Charles received the invitation, he was thrilled. This was the adventure he had dreamed of. But his father was horrified. Dr. Darwin thought the voyage was dangerous and would ruin Charles's chances of becoming a respectable minister. "It's a wild scheme," he declared. Fortunately, Charles's uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, supported the idea. He convinced Dr. Darwin that the voyage would be educational and would help Charles mature. Reluctantly, Dr. Darwin gave his permission. On December 27, 1831, HMS Beagle set sail from England with Charles Darwin aboard. The ship was small, only 90 feet long, and Charles's cabin was so tiny that he had to remove a drawer to have room for his feet when he slept. But Charles didn't care about the discomfort. He was about to begin the greatest adventure of his life. The voyage was supposed to last 2 years. It would actually take 5 years and carry Charles around the entire world. Charles's first weeks aboard the Beagle were miserable. He suffered from terrible seasickness that made him vomit almost constantly. He wrote in his diary, "I hate every wave of the ocean with a fervor which probably no landsman can understand." But when the ship reached its first major stop, the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa, Charles forgot all about his seasickness. He was amazed by everything he saw: tropical plants he had never imagined, colorful birds, and strange insects. Most exciting of all, he found evidence in the rocks that the islands had been lifted up from the ocean floor over millions of years. As the Beagle sailed down the coast of South America, Charles made discovery after discovery. In Brazil, he was overwhelmed by the diversity of life in the tropical rainforest. In one day, he collected 69 different species of beetles, more variety than existed in all of England. Charles also made an important observation. The animals and plants changed gradually as he traveled from place to place. Animals that were similar but slightly different lived in neighboring regions. This pattern would later become crucial to his theory of evolution. In Argentina, Charles found fossils of giant extinct animals that looked similar to smaller animals still living in South America. He found the fossil of a giant ground sloth the size of an elephant, and the fossil of an armadillo as big as a small car. Why, he wondered, had these giant animals disappeared, while their smaller relatives survived? Charles also experienced the power of natural disasters. In Chile, he witnessed a massive earthquake that lifted the land several feet in just a few minutes. He realized that if small changes could happen quickly, enormous changes could occur over millions of years. In September 1835, the Beagle reached a group of volcanic islands about 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador, the Galapagos Islands. These remote islands would provide Charles with the key insights that would lead to his theory of evolution. The Galapagos Islands were like nothing Charles had ever seen. The landscape was harsh and volcanic, covered with black lava rock and strange cactus trees. The animals showed no fear of humans because they had evolved without human contact. Charles walked among giant tortoises that weighed as much as grown men. He observed marine iguanas that dove into the ocean to feed on seaweed, the only lizards in the world that lived in the sea. He saw flightless cormorants that had lost the ability to fly because they had no predators on the islands. But it was the finches that would prove most important to Charles's thinking. At first, Charles thought the small brown birds on different islands were completely different types of birds. Some were warblers, some were blackbirds, some were finches. But later analysis revealed that they were all finches, closely related, but with different shaped beaks. On islands where the main food was large, hard seeds, the finches had evolved large, strong beaks for cracking tough shells. On islands where main food was small seeds, the finches had small, delicate beaks. On islands where finches fed on insects, they had long, thin beaks perfect for catching bugs. An even more remarkable discovery was that the mockingbirds were different on each island, but similar to mockingbirds on the South American mainland. It seemed as if animals had arrived from the mainland and then changed over time to suit their new environments.
The Beagle continued its voyage across the Pacific, visiting Tahiti, New Zealand, and Australia before finally returning to England in October 1836. Charles had been away for almost 5 years and had traveled completely around the world. Charles returned to England as a changed man. He was no longer the young student who had collected beetles for fun. He was now an experienced naturalist with thousands of specimens and a head full of revolutionary ideas. Charles settled in London and began the enormous task of analyzing everything he had collected during the voyage. He wrote a book about his travels that became very popular, making him famous as an explorer and naturalist. But Charles was also thinking about a much more important and controversial idea. All his observations, the fossils in South America, the animals of the Galapagos, the patterns of similarity and difference he had seen, pointed to a shocking conclusion. All living things had evolved from common ancestors over millions of years. This idea was revolutionary and dangerous. In 1830s England, most people believed that God had created all species exactly as they appeared, and that species never changed. Charles' idea suggested that life had developed through natural processes over vast periods of time. Charles knew that his idea would cause an uproar, so he spent the next 20 years carefully gathering evidence. He studied pigeons, flowers, barnacles, and countless other organisms. He corresponded with farmers, pet breeders, and gardeners to understand how plants and animals could be changed through selective breeding. Charles also worried about the personal consequences of publishing his theory. He was married to his cousin Emma Wedgwood, who was deeply religious. He knew that his ideas would upset her and many of his friends. For 20 years, Charles continued to gather evidence while keeping his theory secret. He wrote out his ideas in private notebooks and letters, but he was afraid to publish them. He once wrote to a friend, "It is like confessing a murder." But in 1858, Charles received a letter that forced him to decide. Alfred Russel Wallace, a young naturalist working in Indonesia, had independently developed the same theory of evolution. Wallace asked Charles to review his paper before submitting it for publication. Charles was shocked. After 20 years of secret work, someone else had reached the same conclusion. Charles's friends arranged for both men's ideas to be presented together at a meeting of the Linnean Society in London on July 1, 1858. Realizing he could no longer delay, Charles began frantically writing a book to present his evidence to the world. He called it On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. On November 24, 1859, On the Origin of Species was published. All 1,250 copies sold out on the first day. Charles's book presented overwhelming evidence that all living things had evolved from common ancestors through a process he called natural selection. Natural selection worked like this. In any population of animals or plants, individuals varied slightly from one another. Those individuals with characteristics that helped them survive and reproduce would have more offspring. Over many generations, helpful characteristics would become more common, while harmful ones would disappear. The reaction to Charles's book was explosive. Some scientists immediately recognized the truth and importance of his theory. Others were outraged and fought against it. Religious leaders condemned the book as an attack on God and the Bible. The most controversial implication of Charles's theory was that humans had also evolved from earlier species. Though Charles barely mentioned humans in On the Origin of Species, everyone understood what his theory meant. Humans were not specially created, but were part of the natural world, related to all other living things. The debate raged in newspapers, scientific journals, and public meetings. In 1860, at a famous debate at Oxford University, Bishop Samuel Wilberforce mockingly asked biologist Thomas Huxley whether he was descended from an ape on his grandfather's or grandmother's side. Huxley replied that he would rather be descended from an ape than from a man who used his intelligence to ridicule scientific truth.
Despite the controversy his book caused, Charles himself remained quiet and modest. He lived peacefully at his country home, Down House, with Emma and their 10 children. He continued his research, studying everything from orchids to earthworms. Charles was often sick, possibly due to a tropical disease he had caught during his voyage on the Beagle, but his illness didn't stop him from working. He wrote more books about evolution, including The Descent of Man, which specifically discussed human evolution. Over time, Charles' theory gained acceptance among scientists around the world. Evidence from fossils, anatomy, and embryology all supported evolution. Even religious thinkers began to accept that evolution could be God's method of creation. Charles received many honors during his lifetime, including honorary degrees from universities across Europe. He was elected to the Royal Society and received its highest award, the Copley Medal. Charles Darwin died peacefully on April 19, 1882, at age 73. Despite the controversy his ideas had caused, he was honored with burial in Westminster Abbey, next to other great British scientists like Isaac Newton. Charles Darwin's voyage on the Beagle lasted 5 years, but the journey of understanding he began continues today. His theory of evolution by natural selection remains the foundation of modern biology, helping us understand everything from medicine to conservation. Charles showed us that we are part of the natural world, connected to every living thing through the long history of evolution. His work revealed that life is even more wonderful and amazing than we had imagined, not because it was created instantly, but because it developed over billions of years through countless small changes and adaptations. Most importantly, Charles Darwin teaches us the value of careful observation, patient thinking, and the courage to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it challenges our most basic beliefs about ourselves and our place in the world. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey with Charles Darwin. Remember, the natural world around you is full of wonders waiting to be discovered. All you need is curiosity, patience, and the courage to look closely at the world with fresh eyes.